Final Fantasy XVI is out and has been met with a mix of review bombing and general praise. But let's talk about it. Now, I haven't beaten the game myself, I'm probably a quarter of the way through roughly, but I've been absolutely adoring the game. It legitimately has just gotten better and better with each new dungeon and monolithic boss fight encounter. It's been blowing me away from time to time with the risks that were taken and how much they have seemingly all paid off in constructing one of the most fulfilling entries in the series I've ever played. It feels like they went into a boardroom and had a discussion as to how to create a game to appeal to me specifically. Everything is hitting for me. And Final Fantasy, funnily enough, has been a series always marked by change, iteration, and risk-taking, despite what some people want to try and tell you. And determining the future direction for this series has always been difficult to do since, well, the series is always changing and trying new things out. But I think with the quality of the game that is Final Fantasy XVI, and assuming the game sells well enough, I have a bit of an idea as to what the future of Final Fantasy may hold. But going back to that idea, the series is always changing. From the introduction of the ATB with 4, to the introduction of the job system, to the new art style with 7, to fully 3D environments with 10 or 11 and 14's MMO DNA, 12's Gambit and unrandomized encounters, 15's real-time warp strike-based combat, mixed with a more modernized open world, and now 16's combo-oriented real-time action gameplay, sprinkled all the while with an ever-evolving magic and materia system. The series has undergone extensive change in nearly every aspect, and migrating from a series known for its regular and rapid release schedule in the late 90s to one that is far more spread out in the modern day, but interlaced with MMO expansions for 14, and spin-offs or remakes that tide people over while the next numbered game is in development. That will inevitably change how each new entry is received when each title has more spotlight than when the series essentially pumped out games every year. The series still kinda does in a way, or at least every other year, but each numbered game is more spread out, so they have far more time in the sun. And I'm a small channel, but even from the comments I receive, people who are new to this series or have never touched it want to play this game because the standard of quality is clearly present, it looks unique and epic and enjoyable top to bottom. The game is a visual spectacle from the combat side of things, but it's also fun to play. And I'm someone who got into Final Fantasy rather late in the game with 15's release, but I've gone back and played quite a few, and the DNA of Final Fantasy is undoubtedly there if you have played 16. But to me, when I talk about 16 being the future, it's for one reason: Naoki Yoshida and the entirety of Creative Business Unit 3. If you are not a Final Fantasy XIV player, you may not know those people, or you may have only been introduced to them from the pre-release marketing for 16, or have heard 14 players like myself talk about how good of a job Creative Business Unit 3 did and continues to do for Final Fantasy XIV. Let's be completely honest with ourselves. Final Fantasy X was a smash hit, and for good reason. To me, 10 is the best representation of the turn-based era with all its changes and variation that came with it in the series. But afterwards, the series' quality level becomes wildly inconsistent. Same thing with its reception. 11 is an extremely grindy MMO that won't be everyone's cup of choice. It made a big splash for being one of the first big-time MMORPGs on a console, but that style of game is not gonna be for everyone, especially for a series known for its first and foremost single-player games. 12 is largely just Star Wars with a way harder Chewbacca, and a combat system based around gambits. Essentially block code the game. That I personally didn't enjoy, but others did. Another very polarizing entry both story-wise and gameplay-wise. The 13 series, I mean, it's 13. It's seen a little bit of love in recent years by certain people and sold well enough, but critically, was a bit of a rough patch for the series for many people. 14 had an absolutely horrendous, almost laughably terrible launch, and was another MMO. But what happened? Naoki Yoshida came into the picture, and along with the collective effort of himself and the developers, and everyone working on the game, they managed to salvage the game and have it blossom. 15 is the epitome of missed potential, where it has a bunch of good ideas that suffer from drastic pacing issues, underdevelopment, or clunky controls, or just bizarre design ideas. I love 15, don't get me wrong here, it was my first FF that I beat, but it's extremely rough around the edges. 16 just doesn't really have that. It's polished, you know, it has a few frame rate issues here and there, but nothing major at least that I've noticed. Haven't had any camera issues like I had in 15. And the story has been extraordinarily well-paced, interlacing world building and character development with big bombastic climactic moments, all while telling a compelling political narrative with important themes and motifs, which is intrinsically Final Fantasy. The combat is silky smooth, with a low skill floor, but a high skill ceiling where I'm always feeling like I can learn a bit more and get better as a player, and the game throws new mechanics and abilities at me often enough to where the gameplay doesn't become repetitive. I've heard one criticism that the game's too easy, and have you ever played Final Fantasy? It's not exactly a series known for its difficulty, but even then the encounters are getting more mechanically complex, and the sheer variation in all these fights is really fun in my opinion. Learning how they all operate, learning the dance and perfecting it, getting better at it, weaving in different abilities, trying new combos out, seeing how to get higher scores in arcade mode. The story itself is bold and willing to take risks, and just has this creative freedom behind it that, say, an MMO doesn't have as a genre. The world in 16 is freeform, it's malleable, able to change with battle lines constantly being drawn and redrawn. The world evolves, and you as Clive evolve right alongside it. Nothing feels safe, and it just feels compelling, filled with interesting characters and an unpredictable narrative. The only part that has felt like filler to me has been the early game side quests, and those picked up significantly as side quests transformed from standard fetch and kill quests to ones with a little narrative behind them that expands on the comings and goings and general worldview of the people that live in Valstia. The game is dark, but doesn't overutilize anything, and in my opinion, it just makes the world feel more, well, mature and realistic, while also still retaining those majestic high fantasy elements that make Final Fantasy worlds so unique and distinguished. It's a level of polish that I personally haven't seen from this series since, well, the Final Fantasy XIV expansions. But in terms of the single-player games, at least the mainline entry ones, the numbered ones, since 10, which was in 2001, over 20 years ago. You could count 7 Remake, and that's just another thumbs up for me for modern Final Fantasy. And it's this level of polish and the feeling of the game being a complete experience without those strings attached of microtransactions or bugs that we have come to expect with many modern day games that makes 16 so refreshing in many ways. The game top to bottom feels like a massive passion project from Creative Business Unit 3, headed up by Yoshi-P, and it oozes references and callbacks to 14 in numerous ways, from certain boss arenas being almost one for one to certain themes and parallels in the storytelling. The main issue that I think 16 will have in the long run is that it's a PlayStation exclusive, at least for right now, so it doesn't have immediate access to the markets that, say, 15 had access to. It doesn't mean 16 can't be a success or sell well, but I'm not expecting it to sell as well as 15 initially, simply because of that, because 15 was available to more people. But if the game does well enough, which I think it will, I can see Yoshi-P essentially taking up the role of the Final Fantasy guy, quote-unquote, for Square Enix alongside the 7 Remake team. I haven't finished the game yet, heck, I'm not even halfway through, but that's how high quality the game is so far. And as long as it doesn't suffer from a similar weird pacing issue that 15 had, where you hit a certain chapter and just abandon everything the game had established up to that point, speaking in terms of the world, and just beelines the narrative and rushes through it. And if 16 can keep up this pacing, both gameplay progression and story-wise, then I think 16 is going to end up being one of my favorite FFs all around, and it will easily be my game of the year. But Final Fantasy as a series is marked by its ability to try new things and never sticking itself in a rut for too long. Sometimes that's for the best, and sometimes that's for the worse, where they change things that probably shouldn't have been changed, or they try something new and it clearly needed more time in the oven, 15. And by the nature of Final Fantasy being a series based on changing and growing and trying new stuff out, that can alienate and will alienate some people from time to time. But it also attracts new people to the series as well. I think Jesse Cox recently released an extremely well-spoken video on this subject matter, and I entirely agree with him. FF is a game and a series predicated on its ability to change and evolve with the times. And it should always be a series that's at the forefront of new trends. It should be the trend maker, not the trend follower. It should be the setter. Heck, and I'm one of those people that came from Final Fantasy 15. That's the game that got me into the series. It wasn't the best game ever, but I loved it all the same, and then tried the others, and didn't get bored since they all had their own individual identity. And while I don't want Final Fantasy to just become any one thing, what I do want and hope will happen is that the game and the series maintains an identity of this level of polish and cohesion that Yoshi-P seemingly prides himself on. I don't want every Final Fantasy game after 16 to be just like 16. I want them to go in different directions. But I think Yoshi-P at this point and Creative Business Unit 3 have marked themselves as the Final Fantasy team right now. And I could easily see them being given the reins for more mainline FF games in the future. Final Fantasy has always been a spectacle. 16 takes that up a notch and has some of the most epic encounter designs I've ever seen in the entire franchise. And I'm still so early into it. And when coupled with 7 Remake and what that series is seemingly setting out to do, I think we are seeing Final Fantasy settle into a bit of a groove, where it's not afraid to have different gameplay styles and even tones. But they still feel like Final Fantasy. They are willing to utilize modern technology to create these spectacles, coupled with incredible music, memorable characters, and combat that isn't afraid to try new things or to take inspiration from the old, with heavy and at times overt messaging. That is Final Fantasy, and that seems to be the direction of modern Final Fantasy, and I'm all here for it. I think one of the reasons I have so much faith in Yoshi-P and the rest of Creative Business Unit 3 is because of how they respond to player feedback, and more often than not, coming from FF14, it's not a surprise or a rare occurrence for changes to be made based entirely on player feedback. Take a piece of content from 14 called Bosja. It came out with initially one zone, one new area to explore and to participate in its varied activities. And based on how players responded to that first zone, when its second zone came out at a later date, a number of changes were incorporated that players directly asked for to smooth out the experience. Like, that is the style of development Creative Business Unit 3 does. They have a vision, they have an idea, but they're willing to listen to player feedback. Another example, an entire branch of content came back for Endwalker, the recent expansion for 14, because players started to ask for it. After a surge of new players into the game really enjoyed the deep dungeons of past expansions, so they decided to make a new one for the recent expansion Endwalker. I wouldn't be surprised if future updates or DLC for 16, if it has any DLC, will reflect feedback given by the community, especially if Yoshi-P is given the green light to head up FF17, which honestly, I hope he does. I hope he is able to head up another mainline Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy can't be a series stuck in its ways. It has to be malleable, and largely has for its entire lifetime. It has to be able to change and grow with the times while maintaining that core central vision of Final Fantasy. Big spectacles, coupled with a brilliant cast of characters and phenomenal memorable music. 16 may be a massive shakeup for the franchise, but honestly, I think that's a good thing, and a good sign that Square Enix aren't afraid to at least try to make the series and the franchise an ever-evolving one, so that each entry has its own identity and feels new. For a series who, for the last 20 or so years, has been largely and pretty inconsistent, the consistency and quality that Yoshi-P and Creative Business Unit 3 brings to the table with release after release at this point is exactly what I think Final Fantasy needs, and why I think that team will be the future of Final Fantasy. So I'm going to call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure of making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And hit the bell icon to be notified for when I upload and stream in the future. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games if you can, and as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.